Despite starting his career at a young age, Alexander Reed quickly rose to the board of directors, becoming a seasoned professional in the corporate world through 15 years of experience and a razor-sharp intellect. He'd navigated hostile takeovers, orchestrated mergers worth hundreds of millions, and built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the pharmaceutical industry. He understood power structures, leverage points, and the delicate dance of influence that separated winners from losers in the boardroom. None of that had prepared him for the absurdity of being framed by his own brother. The evidence had been meticulous: falsified accounting records, forged signatures on offshore accounts, manufactured email chains that painted Alexander as the architect of a massive embezzlement scheme. His brother David, co-executive on the board, had played the role of shocked whistleblower perfectly. The authorities had eaten it up. The judge had shown no mercy. 11 months. That was the punishment they had given him. Nearly a year in Westfield Correctional Facility, a mid-level security prison 2 hours outside the city, where Alexander had once commanded respect and wielded real power. Now, 3 weeks into his sentence, Alexander Reed commanded nothing but the few square feet of his assigned bunk in a cell he shared with a man who'd decided that physical dominance was the only currency that mattered. Tommy Bull Hutchins. That's what the other inmates called him. 42 years old, built like a linebacker gone to seed, with a shaved head, cauliflower ears, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from spending the last 8 years in various correctional facilities. Bull wasn't clever. He didn't need to be. In prison, being 6'3" and 260 pounds of muscle was intelligence enough. Alexander, by contrast, was 5'10" and maybe 160 pounds soaking wet. His black hair was still neatly trimmed, a habit from his corporate life he'd maintained despite the circumstances. His frame was lean, almost delicate, the physique of a man who'd spent more time in conference rooms than gyms. He looked exactly like what he was, a white-collar professional who'd never thrown a punch in his life. Bull had recognized this immediately. "Here's how this works," Bull had announced on Alexander's first day in the cell, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd given this speech many times before. "I've been in this cell 3 years. That makes me senior. So there are rules. My rules. You either follow them or face the consequences." Alexander had stood quietly by his assigned bunk, the top one, naturally, and listened. Rule 1. You keep this cell clean. That means you make both bunks every morning. Mine first. Bull had pointed to his lower bunk with a thick finger. Rule 2. You keep my area organized. Fold my clothes. You clean my shoes every morning. Scrub every speck of dirt out if you have to, even with your toothbrush. Keep my shelf neat. I don't want to see any mess. Alexander had nodded, his face carefully neutral. Already his mind was working, cataloging information, looking for angles. This was just another negotiation. Different setting, different stakes, but the fundamentals remained the same. Rule 3. Commissary. When you buy anything, you clear it with me first. If I want something, you get it. If I want to trade something you bought, that's my call. Bull had stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. Rule 4. Yard time, rec time, meals. You don't embarrass me. You don't make me look bad. You do what I say, when I say it, and we won't have problems. And if we do have problems? Alexander had asked quietly. Bull had smiled, showing teeth that had seen too many fights. Then you learn real quick that there's nobody here who's gonna save you. Guards don't care about cell disputes. Other inmates sure as hell won't help. In here, might makes right. And brother, I got all the might. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Alexander had followed the rules. He'd made the bunks every morning, Bull's first, corners tight and military precise. He'd folded Bull's orange prison uniforms and organized his meager possessions. He'd handed over half his commissary purchases without complaint. Candy bars, instant coffee, cigarettes for trading. He'd cleaned the cell's toilet, mopped the floor, and kept his own belongings confined to his assigned shelf and the space under his top bunk. He'd been, by all appearances, the perfect subordinate. Bull had interpreted this as weakness, as surrender, as proof that his system worked, that physical dominance was absolute, that Alexander Reed, formerly a man who commanded six-figure salaries and made decisions that affected thousands of employees, was nothing more than a scared white-collar criminal who knew his place. Bull was wrong. Alexander hadn't been surrendering. He'd been observing. He was collecting information, building a profile. In the corporate world, Alexander's specialty had been identifying leverage points, the weak spots in a competitor's strategy, the vulnerabilities in a business model, the psychological pressure points that could turn a negotiation in his favor. He'd made millions by understanding that every system, every person, every organization had flaws. You just had to be patient enough to find them. Bull Hutchins was no different. He was just another system to analyze. Over 3 weeks, Alexander had learned everything. Bull's daily routine was rigid. He woke at 6 a.m., used the toilet first, another rule, then did push-ups and sit-ups in the small floor space between the bunks. He was obsessive about his appearance despite being in prison, spending time each morning carefully shaving his head with a disposable razor. He had a sweet tooth, hoarding candy from commissary purchases and trading for more. He was paranoid about other inmates, specifically a group of younger prisoners he believed were disrespecting him, though Alexander had observed no such behavior. Most importantly, Bull was prideful. Deeply, pathologically prideful. His entire identity was wrapped up in being tough, being respected, being feared. The cell rules weren't really about having clean space or getting extra commissary items. They were about dominance, about proving every single day that he was in control. Pride was exploitable. Alexander sat on his top bunk one evening, 3 weeks and 2 days into his sentence, and considered his options. Bull was below, eating a candy bar he'd demanded from Alexander's last commissary purchase, listening to a small radio through a single earbud. The problem was straightforward. Bull would never voluntarily stop the arrangement. He enjoyed it too much, and direct confrontation was impossible. Alexander had no illusions about his ability to win a physical fight. Even if he caught Bull off guard, even if he landed a lucky punch, the size and strength difference was too great. Violence wasn't the answer, but violence didn't need to be the answer. In Alexander's experience, the most effective way to remove an obstacle wasn't to destroy it directly. It was to make the obstacle destroy itself. He needed Bull to do something that would force the prison administration to move him to a different cell. Something serious enough that Bull couldn't talk his way out of it, but subtle enough that Bull wouldn't see it coming until too late. Alexander began planning. The first piece of the puzzle came during breakfast the next morning. Alexander sat at his assigned table, alone, as Bull preferred to eat with other long-timers, and observed the cafeteria dynamics. Westfield operated like any hierarchical organization. There were leaders, followers, and people who existed in the cracks between. One of those crack dwellers was Marcus Chen, a thin Asian inmate in his 50s, who worked in the prison laundry. Marcus kept his head down, spoke to almost no one, and had a reputation for being able to acquire things, small contraband items, nothing major, but useful. A cell phone charging cable here, an extra blanket there, occasionally harder items like tobacco or pills. Alexander had done his homework. Marcus had been inside for 2 years on embezzlement charges. Corporate crime. They were the same species. During afternoon yard time, Alexander positioned himself near the basketball court, where Marcus usually spent his recreation hour, not playing but watching, staying invisible. Alexander approached slowly, non-threateningly. "Marcus Chen," he said quietly. Marcus's eyes flickered toward him, wary. In prison, unsolicited approaches meant trouble. "Don't know you." "Alexander Reed. I'm in B block, cell 47. "Okay." Marcus started to turn away. "I have a business proposition." That stopped him. Marcus studied Alexander more carefully. The lean frame, the intelligent eyes, the posture that still carried traces of boardroom confidence despite 3 weeks in orange prison wear. "I'm not interested in business," Marcus said carefully. "You run a small supply operation, low-level contraband, nothing that attracts major attention. You're careful, you're smart, and you've been doing it successfully for 2 years without getting caught." Alexander kept his voice conversational. "That tells me you understand risk management." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Alexander saw the micro-reaction, the slight tension in the shoulders, the calculation behind the eyes. He was listening. "I need something acquired and planted," Alexander continued. "Nothing that will get you in trouble." "Actually, the opposite. This benefits you." "How does getting contraband into someone's cell benefit me?" "Because the person whose cell it goes into is Tommy Hutchins." Marcus's eyebrows rose fractionally. Everyone knew Bull. More importantly, everyone knew that Bull had been pressuring Marcus for months, demanding free items, threatening him, using his size to extract what he wanted without paying. Marcus hated him, but was too small and too smart to confront him directly. "You have my attention," Marcus said slowly. "I need a cell phone," Alexander said. "Doesn't need to work. Doesn't even need to have a battery. Just needs to look real enough that when it's found during a cell inspection, the administration takes it seriously. Those are hard to get. Expensive. I have money on my books. I can pay." Marcus considered this. "Why?" "Because Tommy Hutchins is going to be found with it in his cell, and possession of a cell phone in a medium security facility is a serious violation. He'll be moved to segregation while they investigate, then transferred to a different cell block at minimum. Maybe moved to a higher security facility if they think he's running an outside operation." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "You're setting him up." "I'm creating a situation where the administration handles a problem." "That's different." "How do I know you won't flip on me?" "Tell them I provided it?" "Because I have no reason to. Once Bull is gone, I have what I want. And you'll have payment, plus the satisfaction of watching someone who's been pressuring you face consequences." Alexander paused. "Plus, I don't know where you get your items." "I never asked, and I don't want to know." "You're insulated." Marcus thought for a long moment. In the distance, inmates shouted over a basketball game, but here in their small bubble of conversation, the only sound was breathing and calculation. $300 on my books," Marcus said finally, "and it'll take a week." "Done. But I need something else." "Of course you do." "I need to know when cell inspections happen in B block. The schedule." Marcus laughed softly. "That's easier than getting a phone. Guard named Peters. He's on the take. Smokes in the equipment room during his shift. I sell him cigarettes. He'll tell me the inspection schedule for a carton. Then we have a deal." They shook hands briefly, a gesture that looked casual to anyone watching, but sealed an arrangement that would, if everything went according to plan, fundamentally change Alexander's situation. Over the next week, Alexander continued his role as Bull's cell servant. If anything, he became more accommodating, more compliant, more eager to please. He made the bunks with obsessive precision. He organized Bull's shelf 3 times, unprompted. He even started addressing Bull as Sir when they were alone in the cell. Bull ate it up, his chest puffed with pride. He started making additional demands, having Alexander hold the mirror while he shaved his head, making Alexander stand while he used the toilet so he had more space, insisting Alexander thank him for teaching him respect. Alexander complied with everything, and with each compliance, with each new humiliation he accepted, without complaint, Bull's guard dropped a little lower. Pride made people careless. On the 8th day, Marcus passed Alexander in the corridor during movement between blocks. Their shoulders brushed, intentional, and Alexander felt the small object transfer into his pocket. No words, no acknowledgement, just a professional handoff. Back in his cell during the late afternoon, Bull was at recreation time, playing cards in the common area. Alexander had exactly 30 minutes. He pulled the phone from his pocket. It was old, maybe 5 years out of date, a cheap Android model with a cracked screen. It didn't power on, which was perfect. This wasn't about functionality. This was about appearance. Alexander studied Bull's area carefully. The phone needed to be hidden well enough that Bull wouldn't find it during routine activity, but obvious enough that a guard conducting a proper cell inspection would discover it quickly. Bull's mattress? No, too obvious. And inmates flipped mattresses regularly. The shelf? Too exposed. Under the bed frame? Possible, but hard to access quickly during an inspection. Then Alexander saw it. Bull's pillow. The prison provided thin, lumpy pillows with cheap fabric covers that zipped closed. Bull had stuffed his with extra fabric, ripped pieces from old uniforms, creating more padding. It was technically against regulations, but nobody cared enough to enforce it. Alexander unzipped the pillow cover, buried the phone deep inside among the fabric pieces, and zipped it back closed. The pillow looked identical to how it had been. Unless someone specifically squeezed and checked, the phone was invisible. Perfect. The next piece was timing. Marcus had delivered the inspection schedule. B block was scheduled for a random cell search in 3 days. Random was a loose term. The guards actually followed a rotating schedule, but inmates weren't supposed to know the pattern. 3 days. Alexander used them to continue his performance, playing the perfect subordinate, letting Bull's arrogance grow, ensuring that when the moment came, Bull would be completely blindsided. On the morning of the inspection, Alexander made Bull's bunk with extra care, tucking in the corners precisely, fluffing the compromised pillow, and placing it perfectly at the head of the bed. "You're learning," Bull grunted approvingly, watching Alexander work. "Took you long enough, but you're finally getting it. See what happens when you follow the rules?" "Yes, sir," Alexander said quietly. "I understand now." Bull clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but carried the weight of dominance. "Stick with me, Reed. Do what I say, and your time here will be easy." Alexander nodded, his face carefully neutral. Inside, he was counting down the hours. The inspection came at 2 p.m. during afternoon work details. Alexander had been assigned to the library, an easy-duty post. Bull was in the workshop doing basic assembly work. The call came over the PA system. "B block, cell 47. Report to administrative processing." Both of them were being taken from their posts back to their cell, where the guards would conduct a thorough search. Standard procedure. It happened randomly in different cells every week. Alexander walked calmly to B block, his heart rate steady. This was just another boardroom presentation, another merger negotiation, another moment where preparation met opportunity. Bull arrived at the same time, looking annoyed but not worried. "Fucking inspections," he muttered. "Waste of time." They stood in the corridor outside their cell while two guards, Peters and a younger officer named Rodriguez, entered and began the search. Alexander watched through the small window. Peters was methodical, checking the obvious places first: under mattresses, inside the small metal locker, behind the toilet. He pulled out the shelf contents, examined them, put them back. Standard stuff. Then Peters picked up Bull's pillow. Alexander saw the moment Peters felt the weight distribution was wrong. Saw him squeeze the pillow, feel the hard object inside. Saw his expression change. Peters carefully unzipped his pillow. He reached inside and pulled out his cell phone. "What the fuck?" Peters said, his voice sharp. He held up the phone, looking at Rodriguez. "We got contraband." Bull's face went pale. "That's not mine." "It's in your pillow, Hutchins." "I don't know how it got there. Someone planted it. It's not mine." Peters wasn't listening. He was already on his radio, calling it in. "Sergeant, we have a cell phone recovered from B block. Cell 47. Hutchins's bunk. Requesting immediate admin processing and segregation placement." Alexander watched Bull's world collapse in real time. The big man's face cycled through shock, anger, confusion, and finally, a terrible understanding as his eyes locked onto Alexander's. "You," Bull breathed. "You fucking—" "Step back, Hutchins," Rodriguez ordered, his hand moving to his baton. "You're being placed in administrative segregation pending investigation." "He set me up!" Bull shouted, pointing at Alexander. "He fucking planted that! Search him! Search his stuff!" Peters looked at Alexander, then at Bull. They cuffed Bull right there in the corridor. Alexander stood perfectly still, his face showing nothing but mild confusion, as if he had no idea what was happening or why his cellmate was being arrested. As they led Bull away, the big man thrashing against the cuffs and screaming accusations, he looked back one final time. His eyes met Alexander's, and Alexander allowed himself the smallest smile. Just a flicker at the corner of his mouth. Just enough for Bull to see and understand. "You were wrong," that smile said. "Might doesn't make right. Intelligence makes right. And you never saw it coming." Bull's screaming echoed down the corridor long after the guards dragged him around the corner toward segregation. Alexander stood alone outside cell 47, breathing calmly, his mind already moving to the next phase. Bull would be investigated. The phone would be traced, or rather, wouldn't be traced, because it had no active number and no history. But that wouldn't matter. The crime was possessing drugs. So where did the drugs come from? From the phone hidden inside the pillow. Alexander had carried out this plan with precision. Every day, while collecting Bull's belongings, he had also uncovered the spot where the drugs were hidden. Alexander had been taking small amounts of the drugs each day without anyone noticing, and eventually he had stashed the entire pile inside the phone. Bull's history, 8 years in and out of various facilities, multiple disciplinary actions, would seal his fate. He'd be moved. Different cell, maybe different block, possibly even transferred to another facility, depending on how seriously the administration took the violation. Either way, he was gone. Alexander Reed, the thin, physically weak corporate executive who everyone had dismissed as an easy target, had just removed his problem using nothing but patience, observation, and strategy. The guards finished processing the cell and cleared Alexander to re-enter. He climbed to his top bunk, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. In 3 weeks, he'd learned a fundamental truth about prison that mirrored what he'd always known about corporate life. Power wasn't about size or strength or physical dominance. Power was about information, leverage, understanding what motivated people, and using that understanding to achieve your objectives. Bull had taught him that first lesson about cell rules on day 1. Alexander had just taught him a much more important lesson in return. The cell felt larger without Bull Hutchins in it. Alexander spent his first night in cell 47, lying on the lower bunk, now his own choice, listening to the sounds coming from the other cells. Voices echoing. The constant background noise of men living in cages. But in his immediate space, there was silence. Peace. The absence of threat. It had been 3 days since Bull's removal. The investigation had been swift and bureaucratic. The drugs hidden inside the phone had been found easily. Bull had screamed his innocence, accused Alexander, demanded his cell be searched. They'd searched it. Thoroughly. Found nothing. Bull's disciplinary record had done the rest. The administration transferred him to C Block, a higher security section with single cells. Punishment disguised as procedure. He'd spend the rest of his sentence alone, which for a man like Bull, who derived his entire identity from dominating others, was a fate worse than any physical punishment. Alexander had won without throwing a punch, without raising his voice, without anyone even believing a crime had been committed against him. That was the beauty of it. On the 4th day, Marcus Chen approached him during yard time. The older man's expression was carefully neutral, but Alexander saw the respect in his eyes. "Heard Hutchins is in C Block now," Marcus said quietly. "Single cell, 23-hour lockdown." "I heard that too," Alexander replied. "Funny thing. He kept screaming about being set up. Said you did it." Marcus paused. Nobody believed him. Why would they? I'm just a white-collar guy doing his time. I don't have the connections or the know-how to acquire contraband. Marcus smiled slightly. Right. Of course not. He lowered his voice further. Word's getting around, though. Not about what you did. Nobody can prove that. But about the fact that Bull had you under his thumb. And now Bull's gone. People notice patterns. What kind of patterns? The kind that says, maybe the quiet corporate guy isn't as soft as he looks. The kind that says, maybe there are different ways to handle problems in here. Marcus met his eyes. You made your point. Carefully, cleanly. That takes a certain kind of intelligence. Alexander said nothing, but he understood. In prison, reputation was currency. Bull had spent 8 years building a reputation on physical intimidation. Alexander had dismantled it in 3 weeks, using nothing but patience and strategy. Just thought you should know, Marcus continued. You're not invisible anymore. People are watching you different now. After Marcus left, Alexander considered this development. He hadn't wanted attention. Attention was dangerous. But respect, carefully calibrated respect, that could be useful. The next shift came during dinner 2 days later. Alexander, without complaining, sat alone at a table when an inmate he recognized from B Block, a younger man named Deshaun Miller, mid-20s, doing time for drug charges, approached and asked, "This seat taken?" In prison, where you sat and who you sat with mattered. It was a social declaration. Alexander had been sitting alone since his arrival, partly by Bull's design, partly by his own choice. "You can sit," said Alexander. Deshaun sat down, and for a moment they ate in silence. Then the younger man spoke quietly. I have a cellmate who's doing the same thing to me that Hutchins did to you. He treats me like his servant." Alexander continued eating, saying nothing. "Thing is," Deshawn continued, "I ain't built for fighting. I'm in here on a nonviolent charge. I just want to do my time and get out. But this guy, he's making every day hell." "That's unfortunate," Alexander said neutrally. "Word is you handled your situation. I'm not asking how, don't need to know, but I'm wondering if maybe you got advice for someone in a similar position." Alexander considered this carefully. Deshawn was testing the waters, seeing if Alexander would position himself as a problem solver, a fixer. That path led to complications, expectations, obligations, the kind of entanglements that could extend far beyond his 11-month sentence. But it also led to something else: insurance. In prison, allies mattered. Not friends. Friendship was a luxury Alexander couldn't afford, but people who owed him, people who saw value in his continued well-being. "Hypothetically," Alexander said slowly, keeping his voice low, "if someone wanted to change their cell situation, they'd need to make it administratively necessary. Fighting won't work. That just gets both parties punished. Complaining won't work. Guards don't care about cell disputes. So what would work? Creating a situation where the administration has no choice but to separate the parties. A rules violation that can't be ignored." Alexander took a bite of his food, chewing thoughtfully. But it would need to be clean. Untraceable. The target would need to have no idea it was coming until it was too late. Deshawn absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Hypothetically." "Hypothetically," Alexander agreed. They finished their meal in silence. Deshawn left without another word, but Alexander knew the message had been delivered. He hadn't offered to help directly. That would be too visible, too risky. But he'd provided a framework, a methodology. Whether Deshawn had the intelligence and resources to execute it was his own problem. 2 weeks later, Deshawn's cellmate was moved to segregation after guards found homemade alcohol, Pruno in prison terminology, hidden in his locker. Deshawn looked shocked and innocent during the inspection. The cellmate screamed about being framed. Nobody believed him. Deshawn caught Alexander's eye in the yard the next day and gave a small nod. No words, just acknowledgement. The pattern was set. Over the following weeks, Alexander settled into a routine that looked, from the outside, utterly unremarkable. He worked his library detail, attended meals, kept his head down, followed all institutional rules with meticulous precision. He was the model inmate, quiet, compliant, invisible to the guards. But among the inmate population, something had shifted. He wasn't feared. Fear required displays of dominance, and Alexander made no such displays. He wasn't powerful in the traditional sense. He had no gang affiliation, no crew, no muscle. But he was known, quietly known. As the man who'd made Bull Hutchins disappear without anyone being able to prove how. As someone who understood the system at a level most inmates never reached. 3 more inmates approached him over the next month, always discreetly, always with similar stories. Cellmate problems, impossible situations. They never asked directly for help. They asked for advice, for perspective, for the kind of strategic thinking that came naturally to Alexander but seemed like wizardry to men who'd spent their lives solving problems with violence. Alexander was careful. He never involved himself directly, never touched contraband, never orchestrated anything that could be traced back to him. He simply provided information, frameworks, perspectives. What people did with that information was their business. But each conversation was an investment. Each problem solved, however indirectly, was a debt incurred. Not explicit, not discussed, but understood in the way all transactional relationships are understood. By his third month, Alexander Reed had built something unprecedented in Westfield Correctional. A network based not on fear or loyalty, but on utility. He was the consultant, the strategist, the man who could see solutions that others missed. The guards never noticed. To them, he was just another white-collar criminal doing easy time. The inmates knew better. One evening, Alexander lay on his bunk, still the lower one, still alone in his cell despite 3 potential cellmate assignments that had mysteriously fallen through after Marcus had a quiet word with the block administrator and reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd been sent here by his brother, defeated in the corporate arena by someone who'd used his own tactics against him. David had won that round comprehensively. Alexander had lost his position, his reputation, his freedom. But in losing that battle, Alexander had discovered something unexpected. His skills were transferable. The same strategic thinking that had made him successful in business made him valuable here. The same ability to identify leverage points, build networks, and execute complex plans without leaving fingerprints. All of it translated perfectly to this environment. He'd been sent here to be broken, humiliated, removed from the game. Instead, he'd created a new game entirely. Alexander had no illusions about revenge against his brother. Not yet, anyway. That would come later, after his release, fought in courtrooms and boardrooms with lawyers and accountants as weapons. David thought he'd won by putting Alexander in prison for 11 months. What David didn't understand was that Alexander was learning, adapting, becoming something harder and more dangerous than he'd been before. In the corporate world, Alexander had played by certain rules. Ethics, even if loosely interpreted. Legal boundaries, even if creatively stretched. Social conventions that limited what tactics were acceptable. Prison had no such limitations. Prison was pure strategy, unencumbered by social niceties or ethical considerations. You identified what you wanted, calculated the most efficient path to achieve it, and executed without hesitation or remorse. It was clarifying. On Alexander's last day at Westfield, having served his sentence, he had gathered a few of his belongings and was getting ready to leave. Marcus found him during the final yard time. "Heading out today," Marcus observed. "You're heading out today," said Marcus. "Back to the corporate world?" he asked. Alexander smiled slightly. "Finally. I've got some business to take care of on the outside, too," he said. Marcus nodded slowly. "You learned something in here. I can see it. You came in soft, not weak, but soft. You're leaving harder. Prison changes people." "It does. But most people leave broken or bitter. You're leaving sharper." Marcus extended his hand. "Whatever happens with your brother, I suspect he's going to regret his decision." They shook hands, and Alexander felt the small piece of paper transfer into his palm. He pocketed it without looking. A number, probably, a way to contact Marcus on the outside, if needed. "Take care of yourself, Reed." "You too, Marcus." Alexander walked through the release processing, returned his orange uniform for the dark suit he'd been arrested in, now slightly loose after months of prison food and limited exercise, and signed the final paperwork. As he stepped through the last security door into the free world, the sunlight felt different, sharper, clearer. He'd entered Westfield Correctional as Alexander Reed, disgraced executive, victim of his brother's corporate conspiracy, physically weak and strategically defeated. He was leaving as something else entirely. Someone who understood that power wasn't about size or strength or social position. Power was about information, leverage, and the willingness to act with perfect cold calculation. Bull Hutchins had tried to break him with physical dominance. Alexander had dismantled him with patience and strategy. David Reed had tried to destroy him with legal manipulation and betrayal. That battle was about to resume. But this time, Alexander was playing by different rules. Prison rules. The kind where ethics were optional, and victory was the only metric that mattered. He climbed into the taxi waiting outside the prison gates and gave the driver an address in the city. Not his old apartment, not his old office, but a hotel where he could plan his next moves in privacy. As the prison disappeared in the rearview mirror, Alexander allowed himself a small smile. 11 months ago, he'd been sent here to be broken. Instead, he'd been tempered, sharpened, transformed into something far more dangerous than David Reed had ever imagined. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, Alexander was playing to win.